War is chaos. Glory is rare. And somewhere between the smoke and blood, soldiers found time for pranks, pets, and pickles. Welcome to the American Civil War. Not as you learned it in school, but as a darkly twisted carnival of absurdity and survival. From generals with fake limbs to lice races and submarines prowling icy seas, this war was as ridiculous as it was brutal. Buckle up for 101 facts that will shatter your history textbooks and make you question everything you thought you knew. This isn't just war. It's madness with a side of sarcasm. One Union general, Daniel Sickls, was famous for going AWOL during a battle to visit his wife. You might assume that a general leading troops into battle would be laser-focused, strategically minded, and perhaps even heroically selfless. You might assume wrong. Meet General Daniel Sickls, a man whose priorities in war were as flexible as his morality. Sickls, who, by the way, once shot a man dead in broad daylight and got acquitted using the very first insanity defense in American history, decided mid-battle that bullets flying overhead and soldiers screaming around him weren't reason enough to skip a romantic reunion. Yes, while Union forces clashed with Confederate troops in one of those grand, decisive moments history loves to recount with solemn seriousness, Sickls was busy sneaking out the back door. He went AWOL to visit his wife, no doubt reasoning that marital bliss was a better cause than battlefield heroics. You can imagine the confusion among his soldiers, left behind to fight without their fearless leader. But what's a little abandonment between comrades in arms? Besides, priorities are priorities, and who are we to judge a general choosing love over war? If you find that outrageous, however, wait until you hear about the Confederate general whose limbs had lives of their own. Confederate General John Bell Hood had a custom-made prosthetic leg and arm, and rumor had it he sometimes used them as props for dramatic effect during speeches. General John Bell Hood was not just a fierce Confederate commander, he was practically a walking or limping spectacle. Losing limbs in battle was tragically common during the Civil War, but only Hood had the theatrical sensibilities to turn personal tragedy into high drama. Equipped with a custom-made prosthetic arm and leg, Hood reportedly did what any sensible, battle-hardened soldier would. He weaponized his own disfigurement for maximum emotional impact during public speeches. Imagine attending a Confederate rally, ready for some passionate rhetoric about valor and Southern glory, only for Hood to dramatically wave his detached artificial leg to punctuate a particularly stirring point. The audience would gasp, jaws dropping, before erupting into applause, mesmerized by a display that blurred the line between inspiration and grotesque comedy. Hood understood something fundamental about humans. Nothing captivates a crowd quite like waving around your own detached body parts. If this makes your skin crawl, or at least makes you question the tastefulness of wartime motivational speaking, brace yourself. Because war wasn't just a parade of eccentric generals. It was also about soldiers obsessed with something far simpler, yet equally absurd: food. Many soldiers on both sides would write home asking for specific foods like pickles or candy, as Army rations were notoriously bland. War, historians solemnly remind us, is hell. But they rarely mention the specific kind of hell soldiers faced when biting into Army-issued rations, the hell of flavorless monotony. Imagine spending months on end gnawing on stale crackers, so notoriously hard that even enemy bullets seem softer by comparison, and drinking coffee that tasted suspiciously like mud. Soldiers quickly discovered that dodging enemy fire was nothing compared to the soul-crushing boredom of endless hardtack. Letters home turned into desperate culinary wish lists, filled not with tales of bravery or reflections on mortality, but earnest pleas for pickles, candy, and anything remotely edible. "Dearest Mother," a young soldier might write, "I dream not of home or safety, but rather of dill pickles and peppermint sticks." Home comfort suddenly meant sour cucumbers and sugary confections, reminding us that beneath the glory and tragedy of battle lies the humble human truth. Wars might be fought over ideals, but they're endured through cravings. Yet soldiers didn't just obsess over snacks. They turned boredom into bizarre art forms, including the delicate architectural practice of building houses out of playing cards. Union soldiers sometimes used playing cards to build miniature houses and towns during downtime. When bullets weren't flying and cannons weren't roaring, Union soldiers discovered a far less dangerous battlefield: their own boredom. Enter the oddly charming and oddly obsessive pastime of constructing miniature towns out of playing cards. This was not your casual game of poker or solitaire. This was architectural ambition wrapped in thin cardboard. With nothing but patience, a steady hand, and the desperate desire to make the endless waiting worthwhile, soldiers would stack, balance, and sometimes collapse elaborate card houses that looked like they belonged in a tiny, war-weary Vegas. It was a fragile metaphor for their own lives, balanced precariously, vulnerable to the slightest disturbance, yet stubbornly standing against the chaos of war. Of course, one strong breeze or a careless shove would send these tiny towns crumbling like empires, and the soldiers' reactions probably oscillated somewhere between amusement and existential dread. But what makes this all the more delightfully absurd is that while men were building card kingdoms, just a few miles away, a legendary Confederate cavalry leader was pulling off a caper that reads like a heist movie. Confederate cavalry leader John Singleton Mosby, the Gray Ghost, once snuck into a Union camp and stole a general's horse, leaving a note. John Singleton Mosby earned his nickname, the Gray Ghost, not because he was ethereal or poetic, but because he had an uncanny knack for slipping through Union lines like a specter. Picture this: a moonlit night, an enemy camp supposedly secure, and in strolls Mosby, not with guns blazing, but with the subtlety of a cat burglar. His target? A general's prized horse. In what sounds more like a prank pulled by a mischievous teenager than a military maneuver, Mosby didn't just make off with the horse. He left behind a cheeky note. It's as if he said, "Thanks for the hospitality, but I'm taking this guy for a spin." This wasn't mere thievery. It was psychological warfare wrapped in a cowboy hat, designed to unsettle the enemy with the message, "We can get to you anywhere, anytime, and make a fool out of you while we're at it." It's the kind of bold, audacious move that defies traditional war logic. Because sometimes the best weapon is sheer gall. But the war wasn't all dashing thefts and dramatic getaways. Sometimes the real stars were the ones who silently marched by your side, dogs. The highest-ranking dog in the Union Army was Sally Ann Jarrett, a bull terrier who marched with the 11th Pennsylvania Infantry. War stories often celebrate generals and foot soldiers, but what about the canine comrades? Meet Sally Ann Jarrett, a bull terrier with the unofficial but undeniable title of the highest-ranking dog in the Union Army. Sally wasn't just a mascot. She was a battle-hardened veteran in fur, marching alongside the 11th Pennsylvania Infantry with a loyalty that could make even the grimmest soldier crack a smile. In a conflict filled with death and despair, Sally was a pocket of normalcy, an emblem of fierce companionship and unyielding spirit. Reportedly, she even participated in battles, braving enemy fire, which is either admirable bravery or questionable military strategy depending on how you see it. But the irony is delicious. While human officers were debating tactics and politics, here was Sally, a dog with no political agenda, simply doing her doggy duty with more courage and dignity than some generals. If a bull terrier could find purpose in the chaos of war, what does that say about the rest of us? Speaking of unexpected wartime personalities, Abraham Lincoln's son had his own unique way of leaving an impression. Abraham Lincoln's son, Tad Lincoln, reportedly loved to play pranks on White House visitors and staff. If you thought the White House was a solemn fortress of political power during the Civil War, think again, at least when young Tad Lincoln was home. The president's youngest son had a mischievous streak that might make even modern-day pranksters blush. Tad wasn't content to sit quietly in the background. Instead, he transformed the White House into his personal playground. Visitors expecting stiff political decorum were often met with a surprise courtesy of Tad's pranks. Whether it was sneaking up behind them with a practical joke or turning important meetings into chaotic messes of childish laughter. Some historians suggest Tad's antics were a welcome distraction for a family burdened by the stress of war and assassination threats. Others argue it was a tiny rebellion against the heavy seriousness that seemed to hang in every corner of the nation's capital. Either way, Tad's youthful hijinks humanize a family otherwise etched into history with tragedy and formality. While Tad was plotting his next prank, soldiers far from Washington were taking unconventional pets into camp, proving that war breeds not just discipline, but weirdness. Some soldiers had pet raccoons, squirrels, or even bears that they brought with them into camp. If you imagine a Civil War camp as nothing but grim men grimacing under grim conditions, think again. Amid the mud, blood, and smoke, soldiers found space for an unexpected kind of companionship. Animals. Not just the usual dogs or cats, but a menagerie of the bizarre. Raccoons, squirrels, and yes, even bears. It's almost as if every unit had its own traveling circus alongside its fighting force. These animals weren't just pets. They were morale boosters, mascots, and sometimes accidental chaos makers. A raccoon rummaging through supplies, a squirrel darting through tents, or a bear lumbering around must have provided a surreal break from the monotony and horror of war. One wonders how many bears were recruited and how many simply decided to enlist voluntarily. These fuzzy sidekicks remind us that amidst the worst of humanity, there's always room for strange friendships and absurd comfort. While soldiers cuddled their wild pets, the average human soldier looked like a modest giant compared to today's standards. The average height of a Civil War soldier was around 5 feet 8 inches. At 5 feet 8 inches, the average Civil War soldier was, by today's standards, not exactly towering, but certainly not miniature. This height places these men in the comfortable zone of average American stature of the mid-19th century. Imagine thousands of them, packed into camps, battlefields, and regiments, a sea of men just tall enough to swing a musket, but not so tall as to be unmanageable on horseback or in tight formations. The height might seem like a trivial detail, but in an era where physical presence could influence morale and the very logistics of war, it mattered. A soldier's height affected everything from uniform sizes, which were not always standardized, to the fit of armor, to how soldiers experienced the grueling marches and battles. Plus, when you picture hundreds of soldiers barely over 5.5 feet tall, the mythic giant warrior image dissolves into something more relatable. Ordinary men swept into extraordinary events. And of course, in a world so focused on appearance, many soldiers made sure their identity wasn't lost, even in death. Soldiers often wrote their names and addresses on their uniform tags in case they were killed, so their bodies could be identified. Death in the Civil War was a grim lottery, with bodies often left unidentified on the battlefield or in hastily dug graves. In response to this brutal reality, soldiers developed a simple but profoundly practical habit: writing their names and addresses on their uniform tags. This early form of dog tag was meant to preserve a shred of identity when everything else was lost. Imagine the scene. Amid the chaos of battle, a man clutching a piece of cloth or paper with his own name scrawled on it, hoping it would survive the carnage. This small act of self-documentation was both a hopeful plea and a quiet acknowledgement of mortality. It's a chilling reminder that these men were acutely aware of their likely fates, yet still clung to the hope that someone, somewhere, would know who they were. The tag served as a lifeline between the living and the dead, a way for families to mourn properly, and for the nation to keep some semblance of order amid the chaos. While many soldiers marked their identities with tags, others played their own roles in history under assumed names. Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, briefly served as a Confederate soldier, but deserted after a few weeks. Before he became the sardonic voice of America with quill and wit, Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, had a brief, ignominious stint as a Confederate soldier. The irony is delicious. The man who would famously lampoon humanity's follies tried on the uniform of one side of the war and promptly decided it wasn't his style. Twain's service lasted only a few weeks before he deserted, choosing to abandon the chaos of battle for the relatively safer realm of journalism and humor. This little detour in his biography illustrates a critical point. War isn't for everyone, not even for those destined to capture its absurdities in words. Twain's brief soldiering phase gave him first-hand knowledge of the war's grim realities, which undoubtedly flavored his later work with biting satire. In other words, he dipped a toe in the muddy waters of conflict and quickly swam back to shore, armed with stories that would outlast any battlefield glory. While Twain made his exit, the nation made a grand financial entrance into modern taxation. The first income tax in the United States was introduced during the Civil War to help fund the Union war effort. If you thought income taxes were a modern nightmare, think again. The Civil War gave birth to the first income tax in the United States, a financial weapon to fund the costly Union war effort. Before the war, the government mostly relied on tariffs and sales taxes, but the massive expenses of a sprawling conflict demanded new revenue streams. Enter the income tax, a revolutionary, controversial, and for many, downright unpopular innovation. Imagine the grumbles from citizens suddenly required to part with a slice of their hard-earned paychecks. It was a bitter pill, but one deemed necessary to keep the Union Army supplied and the government afloat. This tax laid the groundwork for modern American fiscal policy, making the war not just a battle for land and ideals, but also a turning point in economic governance. So while soldiers fought in muddy trenches, the government waged a quieter but equally critical war on wallets. Meanwhile, the troops themselves had to deal with another confusing new development, a currency so strange it nearly got rejected altogether. Union soldiers were sometimes paid in greenbacks, a new form of paper money, leading to a lot of confusion and some outright rejection. Money makes the war go round, or at least it's supposed to. Enter the greenbacks, the Union's first foray into printing paper currency on a massive scale. To fund the war effort, the government began issuing these new, brightly colored bills, which were supposed to be as good as gold. Spoiler alert, they weren't. Soldiers and civilians alike were baffled and suspicious. Imagine getting paid with this strange, flimsy paper when you're used to hard coins or nothing at all. Some soldiers outright refused the greenbacks, preferring to hold on to tangible valuables or just ignore the funny money. It was a chaotic dance of trust and confusion. This experiment in wartime finance was both a practical necessity and an economic headache, shaking the very foundations of American currency. The greenbacks were a reminder that war doesn't just drain lives, but can upend the economy in baffling, unpredictable ways. While the troops struggled to make sense of their new pay, some military leaders took to the skies, literally. Balloon reconnaissance was used by the Union Army, with observers floating high above battlefields to report on enemy movements. The idea of floating silently above a battlefield in a balloon to spy on your enemies sounds like something out of a steampunk fantasy, but during the Civil War, it was cutting-edge military technology. The Union Army used tethered balloons, with observers high above the carnage, binoculars glued to their eyes, relaying enemy positions and movements to commanders below. It was the Civil War version of a drone strike, except much slower, wind-dependent, and much more likely to make you a sitting duck if the Confederates spotted you. Balloon reconnaissance was ingenious and terrifying, combining the innocence of a child's plaything with the deadly seriousness of war. The sight of a balloon drifting over the battlefield must have been surreal. Soldiers entrenched in mud, looking up to see this floating orb, a ghostly eye watching their every move. It's a stark reminder that war has always pushed technology forward, often in bizarre and desperate ways. And while the Union watched from above, one man watched his cigars, lots of them. General Ulysses S. Grant was known for his love of cigars, reportedly smoking up to 20 a day. General Ulysses S. Grant might be remembered for his military brilliance, but equally legendary was his relentless cigar habit. The man smoked so many cigars, reportedly up to 20 a day, that it's hard to imagine him without one firmly clenched between his fingers. Whether this was a soothing ritual amidst the chaos of war or a stubborn defiance of the stress crushing him, Grant's cigar addiction became as iconic as his campaigns. It also makes you wonder about the smell wafting through his tent during strategy sessions. Did his aides ever plead for fresh air, or were they too scared to interrupt the man wielding both cigar and sword? Grant's affinity for cigars paints a picture of a leader who, despite the monumental pressures of civil war, held on to small comforts. It's oddly humanizing to think of a general methodically puffing away, perhaps contemplating his next move between drags. And before he became the nation's most famous cigar smoker, Lincoln himself was known for an unexpected physical feat. Before the war, Abraham Lincoln was a champion wrestler, known for his strength. Before he was the great emancipator, before the top hat and the Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln was basically the original Renaissance man, except with more muscle and fewer selfies. Long before he faced bullets or politics, Lincoln was a force to be reckoned with on the wrestling mat. Known for his towering height and lanky frame, he wasn't just a tall, awkward kid. He was a champion wrestler who reportedly only lost once in nearly 300 matches. That's right, he was a bona fide badass long before his speeches earned him fame. His wrestling prowess was part of his personal mythology, adding a layer of physicality to the image of a man who could debate law by day and throw down by night. In a way, Lincoln's wrestling is a perfect metaphor for the war itself, grappling with impossible odds, struggling for dominance, and ultimately coming out on top by sheer grit. And while Lincoln was tossing opponents to the mat, soldiers were engaging in far less dignified competitions, racing lice across their skin for bets and bragging rights. A popular camp pastime was lice racing, where soldiers would place bets on which lice would cross a line first. If war wasn't disgusting enough, soldiers found a truly grotesque way to entertain themselves. Lice racing. Yes, you read that right. When trapped in muddy, lice-infested camps, with nothing but time and their own frayed nerves, soldiers turned to betting on which tiny parasites could crawl the fastest. Picture this: grown men, hardened by battle, hunched over the bodies of their crawling tormentors, cheering on microscopic creatures in a race to nowhere. It's a kind of morbid comedy that captures the absurdity of war, finding tiny moments of levity in the most revolting circumstances. The idea of a sport based on blood-sucking pests feels like the ultimate surrender to boredom. A shared joke between men whose lives were constantly under threat, but whose spirits refused to break entirely. Lice racing was less about the insects and more about camaraderie, a testament to how soldiers adapted to misery with humor, even if it was the kind of humor that made everyone scratch uncontrollably. Meanwhile, away from the lice, many soldiers held on to more sentimental treasures. Many soldiers carried photographs of their sweethearts or families, often tucked into their Bibles. Amid the relentless horror of the battlefield, soldiers clung to fragile reminders of home, photographs carefully hidden in the pages of worn Bibles. These tiny portraits of sweethearts, children, or parents were more than keepsakes. They were talismans against despair. Imagine holding a smudged photograph of a loved one while gunfire roared, a desperate attempt to preserve humanity in the face of mechanical slaughter. These personal images gave soldiers a reason to survive, a flicker of hope in a world full of death. The fact that many hid them in Bibles only adds a layer of poignant irony. The sacred book, a symbol of faith and salvation, doubled as a protector of earthly love. This practice was both deeply private and universally understood, a secret ritual of hope whispered in the chaos. It reminds us that war, for all its political and historical weight, is ultimately about the individuals caught in its grasp, each clutching their own fragile lifelines. Yet not all soldiers wore neat gray uniforms. Some took to dyeing theirs in unconventional ways. Confederate soldiers sometimes dyed their uniforms with walnut husks to make them look more gray. In the fashion world of Civil War combat, Confederate soldiers faced a unique challenge: how to maintain that iconic gray look when resources were scarce and uniforms came in all sorts of shades. Enter the humble walnut husk, a natural dye source that soldiers used to give their uniforms that desirable Confederate gray hue. It was a practical, if slightly desperate form of camouflage and identity, turning what might have been a patchy mess of browns and greens into a more uniform appearance. The process wasn't exactly glamorous. Imagine soldiers boiling walnut husks over campfires, the pungent smell of tannins mingling with gunpowder smoke. The result was a spectrum of grays, some more successful than others, but all serving as a symbol of Southern grit and improvisation. This was less about fashion and more about survival and cohesion, a way to project unity even when supplies were tight. While Confederate soldiers perfected the art of the homemade uniform, the Battle of Gettysburg unfolded with its own infamous landmarks, forever etched into history, and lunchroom arguments about the peach orchard and wheat field. The Battle of Gettysburg included a peach orchard and a wheat field that became famous landmarks due to the intense fighting there. Gettysburg wasn't just a battle. It was a sprawling 3-day spectacle of chaos, heroism, and staggering bloodshed. Among its many infamous sites are the peach orchard and the wheat field, two oddly pastoral names for places soaked in violence and death. These weren't peaceful farm spots. They were epicenters of brutal fighting, where soldiers clashed over every inch of ground. The peach orchard, with its idyllic name, was anything but peaceful. It became a bloody crossroads where Union and Confederate forces collided in a deadly tug-of-war. Nearby, the wheat field witnessed some of the war's most savage hand-to-hand combat, the golden stalks turning red with the blood of thousands. These agricultural landmarks became symbols of how the Civil War tore through the very fabric of American life, turning fertile land into a grim stage for carnage. The Battle of Gettysburg and its peculiar place names remind us that war doesn't just destroy armies, it warps the meaning of places, turning peaceful orchards and fields into eternal reminders of loss. Speaking of mascots of an unusual sort, many regiments brought animals to battle that would raise more than a few eyebrows. Some regiments had their own mascots, including eagles, goats, and even a camel. The Civil War wasn't just fought by men. It was also a bizarre zoo of regimental mascots, each more improbable than the last. While dogs were common companions, some units went above and beyond, adopting mascots that could have walked straight out of a circus tent. Eagles soared alongside troops, their majestic presence adding a dose of fierce patriotism or Southern pride. Goats, yes, goats, were sometimes enlisted, probably for reasons ranging from companionship to comic relief. And then there was the camel, because why not? Camels were briefly experimented with by the U.S. Army, and a few somehow made their way into regiments, bewildering soldiers and enemies alike. These animals served as morale boosters, walking mascots of identity, or just hilarious distractions in the hellscape of war. The sight of a camel in a soldier's camp must have been as surreal as it was comforting. A reminder that even in the darkest times, humans crave odd little sparks of normalcy and absurdity. Of course, normalcy was a rare commodity when it came to Army food. Hardtack, a tough, unleavened biscuit, was a staple of soldiers' diets and was so hard it could reportedly break teeth. War is hell, but war with hardtack is hell with a side of dental torture. This brick-like biscuit was the unappetizing backbone of a Civil War soldier's diet. Unleavened, dense, and hard enough to double as a weapon or a building material, though not recommended for either. Soldiers reportedly joked, or grimly warned, that biting into hardtack could easily break a tooth, making it less a food and more a test of jaw strength and patience. The reasons for its widespread use are simple. It lasted forever, didn't spoil easily, and was cheap to produce. Taste and texture? Not so much. Soldiers developed creative and desperate ways to soften the dreadful biscuit, soaking it in coffee or soup, or in some cases using their bayonets as makeshift mallets to crack the rock-hard crust. Hardtack became a symbol of endurance, a daily reminder that survival was more important than comfort. And while soldiers gnawed on their biscuits, General Robert E. Lee's famous steed was doing its own kind of marching. General Robert E. Lee's horse, Traveler, was almost as famous as he was and survived the war. When you think of Civil War icons, Robert E. Lee's name comes up first, but his horse, Traveler, wasn't far behind. This regal steed carried Lee through countless battles, becoming a living symbol of Southern resilience and the general's trusted companion. Traveler wasn't just a horse. He was a legend in his own right, famous for his strength, speed, and the cool, calm demeanor that mirrored Lee's own leadership style. Remarkably, Traveler survived the war intact, a rare feat considering the chaos and carnage that engulfed the battlefield. After the war, Traveler was cared for as a celebrity, living out his days as a reminder of a bygone era. The bond between man and horse was more than practical. It was emblematic of loyalty and perseverance in times of unimaginable hardship. While Lee rode into history atop Traveler, back in the ranks, an enterprising Union private was creating an unusual kind of commerce. A Union private once bought a large amount of onions from a local farmer and started a black market onion trade within his regiment. In the midst of war, some soldiers found opportunity where others saw only hardship. One enterprising Union private spotted an unusual business prospect: onions. Not just a few onions, but a large quantity he purchased from a local farmer, then turned into a black market sensation within his regiment. These onions, pungent and sharp, were a rare luxury compared to the bland and stale army rations. Suddenly, the humble onion became a prized commodity, traded for favors, goods, and whatever else soldiers could barter. This underground trade wasn't just about flavor. It was about control, power, and survival. In the bleak monotony of military life, access to fresh onions was like striking gold, making the private both a supplier and a minor warlord in the microeconomy of the camp. It's a reminder that even in the most structured and brutal settings, human ingenuity finds ways to bend the rules and carve out pockets of profit. And speaking of bending rules, soldiers had other creative uses for their equipment. Soldiers sometimes used old bayonets to cook food over campfires, turning them into makeshift skewers. War might have been about bullets and bloodshed, but soldiers weren't above making use of whatever was at hand, even if it meant turning weapons of death into cooking utensils. Enter the bayonet skewer, a pragmatic yet oddly poetic adaptation. After grueling marches and endless battles, hunger was a constant companion, and campfire meals, often a grim affair, became a small moment of solace. Soldiers lacking proper cooking tools would take their trusty bayonets, those sharp blades attached to the ends of rifles, and repurpose them to roast whatever bits of food they could scrounge up. Imagine biting into a chunk of salted pork or a slab of hardtack, all skewered on a gleaming blade that just moments before was designed to pierce enemy flesh. There's a dark humor in this. Bayonets, instruments of violence, doubling as culinary props. This practical transformation underscores the brutal adaptability soldiers needed to survive, mixing danger with the mundane act of cooking. While bayonets twirled over fires, the demographics of the armies were surprisingly varied in age. The average age of a Civil War soldier was 25, but many were much younger. When we picture soldiers, the mind often conjures up burly, battle-hardened men in their prime, but the reality was more complicated. The average age of a Civil War soldier clocked in at about 25 years old, but many recruits were just teenagers, some barely old enough to vote or even shave. Boys as young as 15, sometimes younger, enlisted by exaggerating their age or slipping past lax recruiters eager for more manpower. These youthful soldiers faced horrors that no adolescent should ever endure: gunfire, death, and the crushing weight of war. The contrast between their tender years and the brutal experiences they faced is a haunting reminder of the human cost of conflict. Many of these young soldiers wrote home, often desperately clutching to whatever innocence they had left. And if age was a barrier, gender was no less flexible. Around 400 women disguised themselves as men and fought in the war, In a time when women were officially barred from combat, around 400 of them defied convention and military regulations by disguising themselves as men and enlisting to fight. These women took on male identities, cutting their hair, binding their chests, and mastering the rough soldier's life, all while hiding their true gender from comrades and commanders alike. Their motivations varied: patriotism, adventure, escape, or the desire to be the part of a cause bigger than themselves. Many fought bravely, enduring the same hardships, injuries, and dangers as their male counterparts, with the ever-present risk of discovery adding another layer of peril. Their stories challenge the neat categories of gender and war, revealing a more complex and rebellious side to the conflict. These women were ghosts in the ranks, silent yet fierce, reminding us that war's boundaries are often more porous than official records admit. While these disguised warriors fought on, Confederate money quietly turned into home decor. Confederate currency became so worthless by the end of the war that it was often used as wallpaper. Imagine being so broke that your money isn't worth the paper it's printed on, literally. Confederate currency, once a symbol of Southern independence and hope, became such a joke by the war's end that people started slapping it on their walls as wallpaper. Yes, those colorful bills, once proudly waved in camp and market, degraded into mere decoration. A tragic comic testament to economic collapse, inflation spiraled wildly as the Confederacy printed more notes to cover expenses, turning once valuable dollars into worthless slips of paper. Families facing empty pockets found themselves literally surrounded by the reminders of their financial ruin. Using money as wallpaper is a perfect metaphor for the South's fate. Beautiful on the surface, but ultimately hollow, offering no real protection or value. It's hard to say whether this was resignation, rebellion, or just a grim joke, but it's a vivid symbol of desperation. If the money was useless, people sought safety elsewhere, behind the lines. There were contraband camps, where formerly enslaved people sought refuge behind Union lines. The Civil War wasn't just a clash of armies. It was also a monumental human upheaval, with enslaved people seizing moments of chaos to reclaim their freedom. Enter the contraband camps, makeshift sanctuaries set up by Union forces where formerly enslaved people sought refuge and protection. The term contraband was a legal workaround that allowed Union troops to classify escaped slaves as confiscated property of war, thereby refusing to return them to Confederate owners. These camps became overcrowded, chaotic places filled with hope, fear, and resilience. While conditions were often harsh and resources scarce, these camps represented a significant step toward freedom and survival. They were sites of new beginnings, where people could rebuild lives amid the turmoil, though under constant threat. The existence of contraband camps highlights how the Civil War was as much a social revolution as a military one, forcing the nation to confront the meaning of liberty. Yet, even amid such upheaval, the war had room for innocent voices, some as young as 10. Drummer boys as young as 10 years old served in both armies. The image of a drummer boy, barely out of childhood, beating his drum amid the chaos of battle, is both haunting and emblematic of the Civil War's brutal reach. Boys as young as 10 were enlisted to serve as musicians, their youthful presence a stark contrast to the horrors unfolding around them. These drummers played a vital role, using their rhythms to communicate orders, rally troops, and maintain marching pace, essentially acting as living, breathing instruments of war. Their small frames often made them less obvious targets, but that didn't spare them from the dangers of battlefields strewn with bullets and blood. The idea of such young boys caught in the machinery of war highlights the blurred lines between childhood and soldiering during this era. These drummers symbolize lost innocence, the way war demands participation from every corner of society, no matter how unprepared or unwilling. As these boys marched and drummed, a remarkable first unfolded elsewhere, led by an extraordinary woman. The first American flag flown over a captured Confederate city was by a free African-American woman. History is full of moments that defy expectations. and this one shines with quiet but powerful symbolism. The first American flag raised over a captured Confederate city wasn't hoisted by a victorious general or a heroic soldier. It was raised by a free African-American woman. This act was a bold declaration not only of Union victory, but also of the profound social upheaval tearing through the nation. In a society where African Americans were often denied basic rights, this woman's act carried a revolutionary message. The Confederacy's fall was intertwined with the hope for freedom and recognition. Her courage to publicly claim this symbol of authority and unity over a former Confederate stronghold is a testament to the complex layers of war, where victory was not just military, but ideological. It's a story often overshadowed by grand battles but rich with meaning. As flags waved, tensions ran high across picket lines, with soldiers exchanging more than just gunfire. Union soldiers would sometimes shout insults at Confederate soldiers across picket lines, and vice versa. War isn't just fought with guns. It's also fought with words, sometimes sharp, sometimes crude, and often downright hilarious. Across the eerie quiet of picket lines separating enemy camps, Union and Confederate soldiers exchanged not only wary glances, but verbal volleys of insults, taunts, and bawdy jokes. These shouted barbs were a form of psychological warfare, but also a bizarre social ritual, a way to humanize the enemy while mocking them mercilessly. Imagine standing in the mud, rifle in hand, only to hear a chorus of profanities or ridiculous nicknames flying over no man's land. It was a strange camaraderie born of shared misery and boredom, a way to blow off steam without firing a shot. Some insults became legendary, repeated long after the war, capturing the sardonic wit of men trapped in a deadly standoff. But while words flew across the lines, real-life espionage took to the water in a much more explosive way. The first successful submarine attack in history occurred during the Civil War by the Confederate H.L. Hunley. Long before submarines became staples of modern navies, the Civil War witnessed the dawn of the underwater warfare with the Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley. This ironclad, human-powered submersible executed the first successful submarine attack in history, albeit with dramatic consequences. The Hunley sneaked beneath the waves to attach a spar torpedo to the hull of a Union ship and detonated it, sinking the vessel. This was revolutionary and terrifying. Underwater attack was no longer science fiction, but brutal reality. However, the victory was bittersweet. The Hunley itself sank shortly after, taking its crew with it, a ghostly reminder of innovation's cost in war. This daring assault marked a turning point in naval warfare and showed how desperation breeds invention. As technology evolved beneath the waves, spies operated above them, trading secrets in the shadows. Spies on both sides used various codes and ciphers to transmit information, some surprisingly simple. In the shadowy world of Civil War espionage, the simplest tricks were often the most effective. Both Union and Confederate spies employed a variety of codes and ciphers to transmit secret information, sometimes using elaborate encryption, but often relying on surprisingly simple methods. Imagine coded letters hidden in seemingly innocent correspondence. Maybe a phrase about the weather that actually signaled troop movements, or a seemingly nonsensical jumble of letters decipherable only by those in the know. Some codes involved basic substitution ciphers. Others used invisible ink made from lemon juice or milk. And some spies employed cleverly crafted poetry or nursery rhymes as secret messages. The stakes were unimaginably high. A single intercepted note could mean the difference between victory and disaster. Yet, despite the complexity of some codes, the human factor often proved the weakest link. Miscommunication, carelessness, or a simple bad day could expose entire operations. The cat-and-mouse game of espionage added an invisible but deadly layer to the conflict, where shadows spoke louder than guns. While spies sent secrets through ink and cipher, soldiers crafted melodies out of nothing. Some soldiers found ways to improvise musical instruments in camp, like banjos made from gourds. When the cannons fell silent and the mud clung less aggressively, soldiers sought solace and distraction in music, even if the resources were laughably inadequate. Lacking proper instruments, some troops improvised, turning everyday items into musical contraptions. Banjos made from gourds, drums fashioned from tin cans, and fiddles cobbled together from scraps became common sights in camps. This musical ingenuity wasn't just about entertainment. It was a crucial emotional lifeline, a way to maintain morale amidst the bleakness of war. Soldiers gathered around campfires, strumming these makeshift instruments, sharing songs that reminded them of home, hope, or sometimes just ridiculous parody. The sound of a gourd banjo twang echoing through a battlefield camp is a poignant image. Beauty born from scarcity, laughter from despair. It's a reminder that even in hellish conditions, humans crave art, rhythm, and the simple joy of song. While music lifted spirits, some generals lifted their faces with notably unique facial hair. General Ambrose Burnside was famous for his distinctive facial hair, which became known as sideburns. If you ever wondered where the term sideburns came from, look no further than General Ambrose Burnside. This Union general was less famous for his battlefield tactics and more for the lavish whiskers that framed his face. Burnside sported a style that was, frankly, over the top, even by 19th century standards, with thick, bushy growth running down the sides of his face, connecting to a mustache, but leaving the chin clean-shaven. His facial hair was so distinctive that soldiers and civilians alike coined the term sideburns in his honor. An ironic legacy considering Burnside's mixed reputation as a military commander. His name lives on more in grooming history than in the annals of great Civil War generals. The focus on his facial hair underscores the strange interplay between personal image and public perception during wartime. While Burnside's whiskers became famous, many soldiers quietly kept records of their lives in diaries. Many soldiers kept diaries, providing a personal glimpse into their daily lives and thoughts. In the midst of cannon fire and marching orders, many Civil War soldiers took the time to scribble down their thoughts, fears, and mundane details in personal diaries. These handwritten accounts offer historians and readers an intimate look behind the official reports and battlefield statistics. Unlike the grand narratives of generals and politicians, soldiers' diaries reveal the human side of war, the boredom, the longing, the small moments of kindness or cruelty, and the ever-present question of survival. Some entries describe the horrors of battle in raw, unfiltered detail. Others recount the absurdities of camp life or a stolen moment of laughter. For many, the diary was a lifeline, a way to maintain sanity, document their existence, and communicate indirectly with loved ones far away. These personal chronicles also expose contradictions, men who were proud to fight yet deeply conflicted about the cost. Individuals who longed for home while enduring the brutal realities of war. Diaries remind us that the Civil War wasn't just fought on fields and in governments, but also in the hearts and minds of thousands of ordinary people. And while these men wrote, a shadow hovered over the nation's leader. Lincoln reportedly had a dream of being assassinated just days before his actual death. In the final days before his assassination, Abraham Lincoln reportedly shared a chilling dream that seemed to foreshadow his own fate. According to accounts, he dreamed of wandering through the White House, encountering a corpse guarded by soldiers who told him the president had been assassinated. This eerie vision haunted Lincoln, adding a layer of tragic irony to his last moments. Whether true or folklore, the story underscores the ominous atmosphere surrounding the president during one of the nation's most tumultuous times. Lincoln's dream captures the sense of impending doom that seemed to lurk around him, reflecting a man burdened not only by leadership, but by a premonition of his own mortality. It's a haunting detail that humanizes a figure often elevated to mythic status, revealing a man vulnerable to fear and forewarning. As Lincoln's dream foreshadowed the violence to come, soldiers were grappling with a more immediate killer, disease. The most common cause of death in the Civil War was disease, not battle wounds. It's a brutal truth, often overshadowed by tales of fierce battles and heroic charges. Disease was the deadliest enemy of Civil War soldiers. More men died from infections, dysentery, pneumonia, and other illnesses than from bullets or bayonets. Poor sanitation, overcrowded camps, inadequate medical knowledge, and lack of proper nutrition created breeding grounds for epidemics that swept through both Union and Confederate ranks. Soldiers lived in filthy conditions, often sharing tents and water sources, making the spread of disease inevitable. Medical practices were rudimentary at best, with no antibiotics and limited understanding of germ theory, leading to high mortality rates even from minor wounds. This grim reality highlights the gap between the romanticized image of war and its harsh physical toll. It also emphasizes how the suffering extended beyond the battlefield, turning camps into floating hospitals of misery. While disease ravaged armies, some acts of heroism were recognized with new honors. The first Medal of Honor was awarded during the Civil War. In the grim theater of the Civil War, where courage was often the only armor a soldier could rely on, the Medal of Honor made its debut as the nation's highest military award. Instituted in 1862, this medal was designed to recognize acts of valor that went above and beyond the call of duty. Unlike today's sometimes ceremonious presentations, the earliest Medals of Honor were awarded with a rawness fitting the brutal times. Recipients ranged from infantrymen who braved storming enemy lines to sailors who risked their lives at sea. The award was as much a morale booster as it was a token of gratitude, a symbol that individual bravery mattered amid the massive, often impersonal machinery of war. The medal's origins during such a violent, chaotic conflict underscore the paradox of recognizing heroism in moments defined by destruction. It also set a precedent that would influence American military culture for generations. While medals circulated, soldiers struggled to send letters home, sometimes on the oddest scraps of paper. Some soldiers sent letters home written on wallpaper or any other scraps of paper they could find. If there was one thing soldiers craved besides survival and food, it was communication with loved ones back home. But paper was a scarce and precious commodity in the camps. So when traditional stationery ran out, soldiers got creative, writing letters on wallpaper, scraps torn from books, old envelopes, or whatever flat surface they could scrounge. This improvisation speaks volumes about their desperation to maintain connections and share their experiences despite the hardships. Letters written on wallpaper might seem bizarre or humorous, but for those receiving them, these notes were priceless, tangible links to distant sons, brothers, and fathers. The texture and patterns of the wallpaper often bled through the ink, adding a strange aesthetic to these wartime missives. This kind of resourcefulness reminds us that even amid destruction, human connections persist. Meanwhile, spies and saboteurs were staging one of the most daring escapades of the war. The Great Locomotive Chase involved Union spies attempting to steal a train and sabotage Confederate lines. Few Civil War episodes are as audacious or cinematic as the Great Locomotive Chase. In 1862, a group of Union soldiers and spies infiltrated Confederate territory with a bold plan: seize a train and wreak havoc on Southern rail lines, vital arteries for troop and supply movements. They succeeded in capturing a locomotive named the General, sparking a frantic chase down the tracks as Confederate pursuers tried desperately to catch the fleeing raiders. The raiders attempted to sabotage bridges, telegraph lines, and tracks to cripple Confederate logistics, turning the chase into a deadly game of cat and mouse across miles of hostile territory. The mission ultimately failed, with many raiders captured or killed, but the daring nature of the raid captivated the nation. It highlighted the increasing importance of railroads and technology in warfare, and showed that intelligence and surprise could shift battles in unexpected ways. While trains raced through forests and fields, soldiers found moments to trade, blurring the lines between enemies. Soldiers often traded items like tobacco, coffee, and newspapers across enemy lines during truces. War may pit enemies against each other in brutal combat, but it also breeds unlikely moments of civility, and sometimes outright commerce. During temporary truces, soldiers on opposite sides would engage in a curious form of détente, trading goods like tobacco, coffee, and newspapers. Imagine the surreal scene. Men who might be shooting at each other hours before casually exchanging prized commodities. During a break in the fighting, these trades weren't just about goods. They were about human connection and survival. Tobacco, for example, was a coveted luxury, essential for calming nerves and passing the endless hours of camp life. Newspapers were windows to the outside world, offering news, gossip, and propaganda, often eagerly swapped for enemy publications to get the other side's perspective. These exchanges blur the stark lines between friend and foe, revealing a shared humanity beneath uniforms and flags. They also reflect the absurd contradictions of war, where enemies can be adversaries one moment and trading partners the next. And while tobacco passed hands, wild myths about soldier habits circulated too. A popular myth was that soldiers would bite off the ends of paper cartridges. But this was rare due to the lead and powder. War is fertile ground for rumors and tall tales, and one enduring myth is that soldiers routinely bit off the ends of their paper cartridges to load muskets faster. While the image of frantic soldiers chomping on paper at the heat of battle is vivid, reality was more cautious. The cartridges contained not just paper, but gunpowder and often lead, making biting them off a potentially dangerous practice that could harm teeth or cause accidental ignition. In truth, many soldiers used their fingers or carefully tore the cartridges to avoid injury. The myth persists, likely because it captures the desperation and speed of loading weapons during firefights, even if it wasn't the norm. This story highlights how war folklore can distort actual practices, turning practical behaviors into exaggerated legends. The real danger lay in much more tangible forms of combat, yet the soldiers' resilience can be seen today in the very landscapes where they fought. Many Civil War battlefields are now national parks. The battlefields where so many soldiers fought, suffered, and died have since been preserved as national parks, sacred grounds where visitors can walk the same fields and hills and try to grasp the enormity of what happened there. These parks serve as living memorials, blending history, nature, and reflection. They're paradoxical places where beauty and brutality coexist. Tranquil woods and rolling hills, hiding scars of violence and loss. By preserving these sites, America has created spaces for education and remembrance, honoring the sacrifices of both Union and Confederate soldiers. Walking these fields, you can't help but feel the weight of history, the echoes of cannon fire, the ghosts of countless unnamed men. National parks transform battlefields from forgotten or neglected grounds into public spaces for learning, mourning, and sometimes even recreation. This preservation also prompts us to confront uncomfortable truths about division and war's cost, questions that resonate long after the last shot was fired. But even as these grounds inspire solemnity, soldiers found ways to face their fears with dark humor, like seeing the elephant. The expression "seeing the elephant" meant experiencing combat for the first time. For Civil War soldiers, the phrase "seeing the elephant" was a grim euphemism for their first taste of battle. It was a phrase loaded with anticipation, fear, and often bitter regret. Before joining the fight, many young men heard tales of glory and heroism, but seeing the elephant was the harsh awakening to the brutal reality of war. The smoke, the noise, the carnage, and the sudden loss of innocence. The elephant symbolized something massive and terrifying, a force that demanded respect and instilled dread. Soldiers would tell stories about their first encounter with it, often with a mixture of pride and horror. It was the moment when romantic notions of war were shattered, replaced by visceral experience. The phrase itself became part of the soldier's lexicon, a way to bond over shared trauma and mark a rite of passage that no recruit could avoid. Yet, when not wrestling with elephants of war, soldiers found ways to create their own games. Some soldiers created elaborate games of checkers or chess using pebbles and sticks. Boredom and monotony were as constant in camp as mud and mosquitoes, so soldiers turned to creative ways to pass the time. Lacking proper gaming sets, some troops ingeniously fashioned makeshift boards for games like checkers and chess, using pebbles, sticks, and scraps of cloth or wood. These improvised games were more than simple distractions. They were mental escapes from the harsh realities around them, offering strategic challenges that mirrored the tactical thinking needed on the battlefield. Playing such games kept minds sharp, fostered camaraderie, and provided a semblance of normalcy in abnormal times. The creativity displayed in turning pebbles into pawns or sticks into chessboards is a testament to human resilience and the enduring need for play, even amid death and destruction. While soldiers strategized over games, political maneuvers unfolded elsewhere, with Lincoln issuing proclamations that changed the war's moral compass. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, only those in Confederate states. When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, it was a landmark moment in the fight against slavery, but its reach was limited and nuanced. The proclamation declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territories were to be set free, but crucially, it did not apply to slaveholding border states loyal to the Union or areas already under Union control. This limited scope was a calculated political move aimed at weakening the Confederacy's labor force without alienating key Union supporters. For many enslaved people in Confederate states, the proclamation was a beacon of hope and a step toward freedom, but it didn't instantly liberate everyone. The actual emancipation was a slow, uneven process that depended heavily on Union military advances. The proclamation also transformed the war from a conflict to preserve the Union into a moral crusade against slavery, changing the stakes and the rhetoric. It was both a legal document and a powerful symbol that would shape the nation's future. Meanwhile, as the war's moral terrain shifted, technology pushed into the battlefield with new weaponry. The Gatling gun, an early form of machine gun, saw limited use during the war. If you think the Civil War was fought only with muskets and cannons, think again. Technology was creeping into warfare, and the Gatling gun was a harbinger of modern combat. Invented by Richard Gatling, this early machine gun could fire multiple rounds per minute, an astounding rate for the time. Imagine the terror of facing a weapon that could unleash a torrent of bullets while your musket took precious seconds to reload. Despite its potential to change the battlefield, the Gatling gun saw limited use during the Civil War. Its bulk, complexity, and the conservative nature of military command meant it wasn't widely deployed. Commanders were cautious, perhaps unsure about trusting such newfangled technology, or wary of logistical challenges. Nevertheless, its appearance signaled a grim future where industrialization would make war more lethal. The Gatling gun was a brutal glimpse into a mechanized hell, though the human element still dominated, sometimes with ironic twists, like soldiers calling out friends' names across enemy lines. There were instances of soldiers on opposing sides calling out names of friends or family members they knew. Amid the bullets and bayonets, humanity sometimes peeked through in the most unexpected ways. Soldiers occasionally recognized voices or faces on the opposite side, long-lost friends, distant cousins, or even neighbors, and would call out their names across no man's land. These fleeting moments of recognition revealed the tragic reality that the Civil War was often a war of brothers, neighbors, and divided families. Imagine the surreal and painful mix of emotions. Relief at hearing a familiar voice mixed with the horror that they stood on opposing sides, weapons ready. These instances punctuated the brutal impersonality of war with sharp personal contradictions, underscoring how political divides shattered communities and kinship. Such moments were bittersweet, temporary respites in a conflict defined by violence. Union General Joseph Hooker's headquarters was famously referred to as Hooker's Division, or Hooker's House, leading to the term hooker for prostitutes, though the link is debated. Union General Joseph Hooker wasn't just known for his military commands. He unwittingly became connected to one of the most enduring slang terms in the English language. Hooker's headquarters and his division earned nicknames like Hooker's Division or Hooker's House. which soldiers and civilians quickly began associating with the area's lively nightlife, and more specifically, the prostitutes who frequented the camps and nearby towns. The story goes that the term hooker for prostitutes originated from this association. However, historians debate this origin, with some arguing that hooker was already in use before Joseph Hooker's time, possibly deriving from older slang or other sources. Regardless of its true etymology, the overlap between a general's name and the seedy side of camp life created a lasting linguistic coincidence that has fascinated linguists and historians alike. It's a perfect example of how war culture seeps into everyday language, often with messy, ironic consequences. While Hooker's name became linked with more than just battlefield exploits, secret plots and sabotage unfolded elsewhere in the war. The Confederate Secret Service once tried to burn down New York City by starting fires in hotels. Espionage in the Civil War wasn't limited to sneaky notes and disguised spies. It sometimes involved outright arson. The Confederate Secret Service hatched a daring and chaotic plan to set New York City ablaze by igniting fires in multiple hotels across the city simultaneously. The goal was to create widespread panic, disrupt Northern morale, and divert Union resources away from the battlefields. Imagine the confusion and terror as flames broke out in the bustling hotels of one of America's largest cities. A civilian war effort aimed not at armies, but at cities and citizens. Though the fires caused damage, the plan ultimately failed to ignite the kind of widespread destruction the conspirators hoped for, thanks to quick responses from firefighters and luck. Still, the incident revealed the breadth of Confederate desperation and their willingness to engage in urban sabotage to turn the tide. This covert warfare extended beyond fire, with civilians and famous figures stepping into unexpected roles on the front lines of care. Many famous authors, like Walt Whitman, served as nurses or hospital volunteers. When bullets ceased their deadly chatter, another kind of heroism emerged: caregiving. Not just soldiers, but famous literary figures such as Walt Whitman took on the grim task of nursing wounded troops and volunteering in military hospitals. Whitman's involvement was far from poetic fluff. He witnessed the horrors of injury, infection, and death firsthand, and his compassion brought comfort to countless soldiers in their darkest hours. These authors and volunteers stepped into a chaotic world of blood-soaked bandages and endless suffering, often risking their own health. Their service added a humanistic layer to the war narrative, blending art with the stark realities of pain and resilience. Whitman's writings were deeply influenced by this experience, infusing his poetry with raw empathy and a somber reflection on mortality. This intersection of literature and medicine reveals the Civil War's complexity, not just as a political or military event, but as a crucible that forged new roles and voices. Meanwhile, the physical toll of war showed in more than just wounds. Soldiers often suffered from camp fever, a general term for various illnesses caused by poor sanitation. Camp fever was a catch-all term soldiers used to describe a variety of diseases and illnesses rampant in the unsanitary conditions of Civil War camps. Poor hygiene, contaminated water, overcrowding, and inadequate waste disposal created breeding grounds for dysentery, typhoid, malaria, and countless other afflictions. These diseases weakened soldiers, lowered morale, and caused far more deaths than combat itself. The term camp fever reflects the fog of understanding at the time. Medical knowledge was limited, and soldiers often couldn't distinguish one illness from another. What they knew for certain was that camp conditions could be as deadly as the enemy's bullets. Hospitals overflowed, and doctors were often overwhelmed, lacking proper treatments or sterilization techniques. The prevalence of camp fever paints a grim picture of Civil War life, emphasizing that survival depended as much on dodging sickness as on facing the battlefield. Yet amid these dire conditions, some battles managed to break new ground, not just in combat, but in scale. The largest cavalry battle of the war took place at Brandy Station, Virginia. Brandy Station, Virginia wasn't just another battle, it was the largest cavalry engagement of the entire Civil War. Picture thousands of mounted soldiers charging and clashing across sprawling fields, sabers flashing and horses pounding the earth in a thunderous cacophony. Unlike infantry battles confined to narrow lines, cavalry battles were chaotic, fast-paced, and brutal, with a mix of scouting, raiding, and all-out combat. Brandy Station marked a turning point, demonstrating the growing skill and confidence of Union cavalry, which had previously lagged behind their Confederate counterparts. It was a day of fierce fighting, close calls, and displays of horsemanship and grit that left deep impressions on participants and historians alike. The battle showed that cavalry could be more than just scouts or messengers. They were a formidable force shaping the war's outcome. Yet, while horses thundered across Virginia fields, another kind of airborne observer floated silently above, changing the nature of reconnaissance forever. Both sides used hot air balloons for observation, but the Union used them more extensively. Civil War armies took to the skies with hot air balloons, turning the battlefield into an early airspace. These balloons, tethered and filled with gas, carried observers high above the fighting, giving commanders a bird's-eye view of enemy movements and terrain. The Union was particularly enthusiastic about balloon reconnaissance, using it more extensively to gather intelligence and direct artillery fire. Imagine observers perched in wicker baskets, binoculars glued to their eyes, vulnerable yet invaluable as they floated silently over deadly conflict below. This aerial perspective was revolutionary, offering a new dimension of strategy that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Balloons were fragile and slow, but provided a unique vantage point previously unimaginable in warfare. They were floating eyes in the sky, often targeted by enemy fire, but crucial to planning. As technology stretched upward, soldiers on the ground engaged in their own peculiar pastimes. The contraband designation allowed Union forces to seize and protect enslaved people as property. The term contraband in the Civil War had a grim irony. Used by Union forces to designate escaped enslaved people as contraband of war, it allowed the Union to seize and protect these individuals without immediately freeing them. Instead of returning runaways to Confederate owners, Union troops provided refuge and sometimes employment within the Army. This legal loophole was a critical step toward emancipation, turning formerly enslaved people into a form of property seized from the enemy. It was a complicated and often contradictory status, neither fully free nor enslaved, but it marked a turning point in the war's social and moral landscape. Contraband camps sprang up near Union lines, becoming places of relative safety amid chaos. This designation forced the Union to confront the realities of slavery and freedom in practical terms, setting the stage for the eventual abolition of slavery. While these shifts occurred, soldiers found comfort in lucky charms. Some soldiers carried lucky charms, like rabbit's feet or four-leaf clovers. In a war defined by chaos and death, superstition flourished as soldiers sought any psychological edge or sliver of comfort. Many carried lucky charms, rabbit's feet, four-leaf clovers, pieces of jewelry, or tokens from loved ones, as talismans against the randomness of fate. These small objects represented hope in the face of overwhelming uncertainty, serving as personal anchors amidst the storm. The belief that a rabbit's foot or a tiny clover could influence survival speaks to the human need to find meaning and control in uncontrollable circumstances. Soldiers clutched these charms while marching into battle, as if the fragile objects could absorb or deflect bullets and death. Whether these charms truly offered protection is beside the point. They were vital for morale, giving men a mental boost when all else seemed lost. This quiet faith and luck coexisted with the harsh realities of war's bloodiest battles, such as Antietam. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. September 17, 1862. A date etched in American memory as the bloodiest single day of combat ever fought on U.S. soil. The Battle of Antietam saw Union and Confederate forces collide in a brutal, unrelenting melee that left nearly 23,000 soldiers dead, wounded, or missing by nightfall. The scale of carnage was staggering. Families lost sons and fathers in waves, fields turned crimson, and medical tents overflowed with the grievously injured. Antietam's intensity shocked even hardened soldiers and civilians alike, breaking any illusions that the war might be brief or clean. Strategically, it halted Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North and gave Abraham Lincoln the political capital to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Yet, the human cost overshadowed tactical gains, exposing war's cruel calculus where victory and loss were inseparably intertwined. The aftermath also led to significant changes in how prisoners were treated, with a notorious prison camp soon gaining infamy. There was a temporary Confederate White House in Richmond, Virginia. When Richmond became the Confederate capital, it required its own seat of power, leading to the creation of a Confederate White House. This residence was the hub of Confederate government, a physical symbol of Southern independence and leadership. It housed Jefferson Davis and his administration, who ran the war effort from its rooms filled with maps, papers, and political intrigue. The Confederate White House was more than a building. It was a beacon of hope for a nation fighting for survival. Yet it was also a fragile emblem of a cause that would soon collapse. The mansion witnessed moments of high drama, decision-making, and despair as the Confederacy's fortunes waned. Its temporary nature underscored the impermanence and desperation of the Southern war effort as Union forces closed in. While leaders met in stately rooms, nurses worked tirelessly on the front lines. Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, was a prominent nurse during the war. Before Clara Barton became the legendary founder of the American Red Cross, she was a relentless battlefield nurse who brought care and compassion to some of the Civil War's darkest moments. Known as the Angel of the Battlefield, Barton defied conventions by moving directly into combat zones, tending to wounded soldiers regardless of their allegiance. She was tireless, fearless, and often faced logistical and societal hurdles simply because she was a woman stepping into male-dominated war zones. Her work wasn't glamorous. She dealt with blood, infection, and death daily. But it was crucial, often the difference between life and death for many soldiers. Barton's experiences during the Civil War laid the foundation for modern wartime nursing and humanitarian aid, demonstrating that battlefield heroism isn't limited to those wielding weapons. Her dedication also highlighted the growing role of women in public life and social reform during and after the conflict. While Barton fought illness and injury on the front lines, many soldiers couldn't even read or write their own letters. Many soldiers were illiterate and relied on others to read and write letters for them. Despite the image of disciplined, educated troops, many Civil War soldiers were illiterate or semi-literate, especially among the lower ranks and rural recruits. This illiteracy created a dependence on comrades, friends, or hired scribes to read and write letters to their families. For these men, letter writing became a communal effort, a blend of trust and necessity. They dictated their thoughts, feelings, and news, hoping to bridge the physical and emotional distance to loved ones. Illiteracy also posed emotional challenges as soldiers struggled to communicate personal hardships, hopes, or needs without direct control over the message. Yet, this reliance on others often deepened bonds within units, as men shared not only their lives, but their words and stories. Letters carried the raw voice of a generation grappling with war, loss, and hope, even when they couldn't write a single line themselves. Meanwhile, a new technology transformed how those messages moved between battlefield and home. The invention of photography allowed for widespread distribution of soldiers' images, often morbidly. The Civil War was the first major conflict extensively documented by photography, forever changing how war was seen and remembered. Photographers like Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner brought the camera to the battlefield, capturing haunting images of soldiers, camps, and most famously, the aftermath of battle. For the first time, families could see the faces of loved ones in uniform, and the public could witness the stark realities of war through unsettling photographs of death and destruction. These images were often morbid but brutally honest, dispelling any romantic illusions about combat. Photography became a tool for both mourning and propaganda, shaping public perception and historical memory. Soldiers themselves sometimes posed for portraits, aware that their likenesses might be all that remained. This new visual record added a deeply human, if haunting, layer to the war's narrative, one that still resonates today. As images spread, so did music and culture within the camps. Dixie was a popular song on both sides, though with different interpretations. Dixie, a catchy and upbeat tune, found a curious place in the hearts of both Union and Confederate soldiers, albeit for very different reasons. Originally a minstrel song, Dixie became a de facto anthem of the Confederacy, symbolizing Southern pride, defiance, and the longing for home. Soldiers sang it with gusto, rallying their spirits amid the horrors of battle. However, the song's cheerful melody and simple lyrics also found fans in the North, where it was sometimes performed ironically or adapted with new words to mock the South. This duality made Dixie a musical battleground, its meaning shifting depending on who sang it and where. The popularity of the song on both sides highlights the tangled cultural roots of the war, shared histories, and conflicting loyalties wrapped up in a single melody. Dixie was more than entertainment. It was a reflection of identity, division, and the complexities of American music during conflict. While songs stirred emotions, flags stirred controversy. The Confederate flag had many variations throughout the war. The Confederate flag is often seen as a singular symbol, but during the Civil War it actually existed in many different forms. Various designs were created and used by different Confederate states, regiments, and even individual commanders, leading to a confusing and colorful array of flags fluttering on Southern battlefields. The most recognizable is the battle flag, a blue saltire emblazoned with stars on a red background. But this was just one variant among many. Others included the Stars and Bars and the blood-stained banner, each with unique symbolism and intended uses. These flags represented more than just military units. They symbolized the fractured nature of the Confederacy itself, with its strong emphasis on states' rights and local identities. The evolution of the Confederate flag throughout the war reflects shifting priorities, political tensions, and the struggle to unify a divided cause under a common banner. While flags flew overhead, some soldiers clung to even smaller sources of comfort, their pets. Some soldiers brought their own personal pets to war, often small dogs. In the midst of death and destruction, soldiers found solace in unlikely companions, personal pets. Many brought small dogs into camp, offering comfort, companionship, and a brief respite from the horrors of war. These animals weren't just mascots. They were living reminders of home, loyalty, and normalcy in a world turned upside down. Dogs helped boost morale, chased away loneliness, and sometimes even alerted soldiers to danger. Caring for pets amidst the chaos was a small act of humanity, an assertion of life amid constant death. For soldiers enduring endless marches, muddy camps, and brutal battles, these furry friends provided emotional support that no weapon or ration could match. The bonds formed between men and their pets highlight the deeply personal side of war, often overshadowed by grand strategies and casualty counts. As soldiers protected their pets, generals prepared to surrender, marking the war's slow end. The last Confederate general to surrender was Stand Watie, a Cherokee chief. When most people think of the Civil War's conclusion, they picture Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox. But the war's end was far from neat and timely. The last Confederate general to surrender was Stand Watie, a Cherokee chief and leader of the Confederate Native American forces. Watie held out until June the 23rd, 1865, more than 2 months after Lee's surrender, commanding a small but fierce band of fighters in the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. His continued resistance highlights how the war's impact rippled far beyond the well-known battlefields of Virginia and Pennsylvania. Watie's role is a reminder of the complex alliances and divisions involving Native American tribes some of whom sided with the Confederacy for their own strategic reasons. As a leader, he embodied both the warrior spirit and the political complexities faced by Native peoples during this tumultuous period. His surrender marked the final formal end to Confederate military resistance, closing a long and brutal chapter. While Waddy's story marks a conclusion, uniforms and their colors continued to tell stories of identity and variation. Union Army uniforms were primarily blue, and Confederate uniforms were gray, but there was often great variation. The blue and gray colors have become symbolic of the Union and Confederate armies, but the reality was much messier. While Union soldiers typically wore blue uniforms and Confederates favored gray, the Civil War was notorious for inconsistent clothing and supplies. Especially early on, soldiers wore whatever they could find or afford. Some Confederates wore homespun browns, or even captured Union uniforms. While Union regiments could look quite different from one another, depending on their origin and supply chain, the gray versus blue dichotomy was more of a gradual standardization than an immediate uniform policy. And in the chaos of war, even rank-and-file soldiers might have mismatched or faded clothing. This variation could cause confusion on the battlefield and added to the complexity of identifying friend from foe. The patchwork of colors on the battlefield reflected the fragmented nature of the conflict itself. While uniforms varied, Union troops wielded a common destructive tactic on enemy infrastructure. Sherman's bow ties were twisted railroad rails, heated and bent by Union troops during their destructive marches. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's infamous March to the Sea wasn't just about burning towns. It also involved devastating the South's transportation infrastructure. One of the most distinctive symbols of this destruction was the Sherman's bow ties, railroad rails that were heated over fires and then twisted into loops or spirals, rendering the tracks unusable. The process was brutal and efficient. Rails heated red-hot became pliable and were bent around trees or tied into grotesque knots resembling giant bow ties. This sabotage crippled the Confederacy's ability to move troops and supplies, making it nearly impossible to repair the damaged lines quickly. The twisted rails became a stark visual metaphor for the war's destructive reach, a cruel reminder that total war targeted not only soldiers, but also the economic lifelines of entire regions. Sherman's bow ties remain a powerful symbol of the harsh realities of modern warfare, where infrastructure became a battlefield in itself. As railroads twisted, so did political fashions, including one famously furry face. Lincoln was the first U.S. president to have a beard while in office, growing it after a suggestion from a young girl. Before Abraham Lincoln became synonymous with his iconic beard, he was the clean-shaven rail splitter known across Illinois. The story goes that in 1860 a young girl named Grace Bedell wrote to Lincoln, politely suggesting he grow a beard to improve his appearance and appeal to voters. Lincoln took the advice seriously, and shortly after, his beard started to grow, eventually becoming one of the most recognizable features in American history. This facial hair was more than just a fashion statement. It symbolized a shift in Lincoln's public persona, from a rustic frontiersman to a commanding figurehead for a nation on the brink of war. The beard softened his angular face, gave him an air of wisdom, and became a reassuring symbol of strength and humanity during the country's darkest hours. Lincoln's facial hair was such a talking point that visitors and soldiers alike noted it. And speaking of strange military experiments, the U.S. Army briefly tested an unusual mode of transport. The Camel Corps was a brief and unsuccessful experiment by the U.S. Army to use camels for transportation in the Southwest. In an era when the American West was still a vast, difficult-to-navigate frontier, the U.S. Army decided to get creative. Why not use camels for transport? Between 1855 and 1862, the Army imported camels from the Middle East and North Africa, hoping their ability to endure heat and carry heavy loads would revolutionize logistics in the arid Southwest. The experiment, known as the Camel Corps, was quirky, ambitious, and ultimately doomed. While the camels proved hardy and capable, they spooked horses and mules, had an unpleasant odor and were difficult to manage. Soldiers, accustomed to traditional mounts, were skeptical and unprepared to handle the exotic animals. With the outbreak of the Civil War, funding and attention shifted away from the project, and the camels were gradually sold off or abandoned. The Camel Corps remains a fascinating footnote, a glimpse into military innovation mingled with absurdity. Meanwhile, despite such odd experiments, soldiers faced very real medical challenges, including vaccinations. Many soldiers received their first vaccine for smallpox during the war. The Civil War was not just a conflict of armies, but also a turning point in public health, with many soldiers receiving their first vaccinations, particularly for smallpox. The crowded, unsanitary conditions of military camps made the spread of contagious diseases a terrifying reality. Smallpox outbreaks could devastate regiments and compromise entire campaigns. To combat this, the Union and Confederate armies implemented vaccination programs, sometimes for the first time in many soldiers' lives. For many recruits, military service meant exposure not only to bullets, but also to cutting-edge medical practices, which were still in their infancy. Vaccination campaigns were imperfect and met with suspicion and resistance, but they marked a crucial step toward modern disease prevention. The war thus accelerated developments in military medicine and public health awareness. As soldiers fought germs and bullets, military strategies evolved, including a blockade plan so ambitious it was nicknamed after a snake. The Anaconda Plan was the Union's strategy to blockade southern ports and divide the Confederacy. The Union's Anaconda Plan was less about dramatic battles and more about slow, strangling pressure, much like the snake it was named after. The strategy aimed to blockade southern ports, cutting off the Confederacy's access to international supplies, weapons, and trade, effectively squeezing their economy and war effort to death. At the same time, the plan involved controlling the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two, and disrupting internal communications and supply lines. This slow, methodical approach was initially mocked by critics who wanted a quick, decisive victory. But it proved its worth over time. The blockade forced the South into scarcity and desperation, while the fractured geography hampered their ability to reinforce or resupply. The Anaconda Plan highlights the strategic patience and resourcefulness that underpinned Union victory, showing that wars aren't won solely in bloody clashes, but in economic and logistical chokeholds. While the blockade tightened, Confederate naval forces struck with cunning. The CSS Alabama was a famous Confederate raider ship that sank numerous Union merchant vessels. The CSS Alabama was the Confederacy's most notorious raider, a swift, elusive warship that prowled the seas, wreaking havoc on Union merchant shipping. Commissioned in 1862 and built secretly in Britain, the Alabama was designed to disrupt northern trade by attacking and capturing commercial vessels, thereby crippling the Union economy and diverting naval resources. The ship's captain, Raphael Semmes, became a legendary figure, turning the Alabama into a floating nightmare for Union merchants. Over its 2-year career, the Alabama captured or sank more than 60 ships, showcasing the importance of naval power beyond traditional battle lines. The Alabama's exploits also strained international relations, as Britain's involvement in building Confederate raiders sparked diplomatic tensions. Though eventually sunk by the USS Kearsarge in 1864, the CSS Alabama left an indelible mark on naval warfare history and the Civil War itself. Meanwhile, back on land, battles sometimes tore through places where people's lives and farms collided. Some battles were fought on family farms, leading to incredible stories of civilians caught in the crossfire. Civil War battles weren't confined to distant, deserted fields. They often erupted right on family farms, turning places of home and livelihood into bloody battlefields. Imagine waking up to find cannons firing over your livestock, fences torn down, and your land soaked in blood. These civilians were thrust unwillingly into the war's chaos, their farms becoming strategic grounds or temporary encampments for soldiers. Stories abound of families sheltering in cellars as gunfire tore through fields where their ancestors had toiled. Crops were trampled, homes damaged or destroyed, and the familiar transformed into scenes of terror and loss. These personal stories reveal the war's devastating reach, showing that it wasn't just armies, but ordinary people and their property that suffered. The intersection of war and home created profound tragedies and complicated loyalties, as neighbors found themselves on opposing sides. While civilians endured, generals occasionally faced their own legal troubles far from the front lines. General Grant was once arrested for speeding in his carriage in Washington, D.C. Even great generals are not immune to the mundane irritations of civilian law enforcement. Ulysses S. Grant, famed for his unyielding military tenacity and later as president, once found himself on the wrong side of Washington, D.C.'s traffic laws. Yes, the man who led the Union to victory was actually arrested for speeding in his carriage, apparently driving faster than city regulations allowed. This anecdote is a rare glimpse of humor and humility in Grant's storied life, reminding us that even legendary figures had everyday run-ins with authority. The incident highlights the tension between military prestige and civilian oversight, and how rules applied universally, even to the nation's heroes. It also serves as a reminder that behind the strategic genius and cigar smoke, Grant was a man navigating a world governed by petty laws and small frustrations. While Grant dealt with traffic cops, soldiers learned a grim lesson about terminology in war. The term casualties included those killed, wounded, missing, or captured. When we hear about casualties in war, the mind often jumps to death tolls, but the term casualties in the Civil War had a broader, more sobering meaning. It encompassed not only those killed outright, but also the wounded, who might survive, soldiers missing in action, and those taken prisoner by the enemy. This broader definition underscores the complex human cost of war. Thousands of men rendered ineffective for service, some forever changed physically or mentally, others lost to the fog of battle. Casualty reports became a grim barometer of a battle's toll, with numbers that could confuse as much as inform. The staggering scale of casualties often overwhelmed medical facilities, transportation, and record-keeping. The word casualty became a cold, bureaucratic label masking individual stories of suffering, loss, and survival. Soldiers had to reckon with this reality daily, often hiding parts of themselves, not just wounds, but identities. Soldiers often used pseudonyms when writing letters to avoid censorship or to hide their identity. In a war where information was power, soldiers became masters of disguise, not just on the battlefield, but on paper. To evade strict military censorship and protect their loved ones, many soldiers used pseudonyms or code names when writing letters home. This allowed them to speak more freely, share sensitive information, or shield family members from repercussions should the letters fall into enemy hands. Sometimes pseudonyms were playful, nicknames, or invented identities that concealed true authorship. This practice highlights the pervasive presence of censorship and the precariousness of communication during the war. Letters had to be carefully crafted to avoid revealing troop movements or morale issues, yet soldiers craved authenticity and connection. Using pseudonyms was a way to navigate these conflicting demands, balancing secrecy with the human need to be heard. Meanwhile, soldiers' colorful language gave birth to enduring sayings, one of which boldly encouraged self-reliance. The phrase root, hog, or die was common, meaning to fend for yourself. In the brutal and often lawless environment of the Civil War, the phrase root, hog, or die echoed the harsh realities soldiers faced daily. Originally a Southern saying, it encapsulated a stark choice: fend for yourself or perish. The phrase comes from the image of wild hogs foraging for roots to survive, a fitting metaphor for soldiers who had to rely on their own wits and resilience to endure the hardships of war. There was no room for weakness or dependency. Survival demanded self-reliance, quick thinking, and a fierce will to push through adversity. Whether scavenging for food, navigating unfamiliar terrain, or enduring the mental strain of combat, soldiers internalized this mantra. It reflected the broader cultural ethos of the time, an unapologetic toughness and individualism in the face of chaos. Yet, despite this rugged self-reliance, many veterans went on to become pillars of American society, showing that the war's crucible forged unexpected leaders. Many Civil War veterans went on to become prominent figures in American society. The Civil War, devastating as it was, also acted as an unlikely incubator for future American leaders. Many veterans transitioned from the horrors of the battlefield to influential roles in politics, business, education, and civic life. Their wartime experiences forged character, leadership skills, and a deep understanding of the nation's fractures and aspirations. Some, like Ulysses S. Grant, ascended to the presidency. Others became senators, governors, or community organizers. Their military service gave them credibility and a platform to shape Reconstruction, industrial growth, and the social fabric of the post-war United States. Veterans carried with them stories of sacrifice and a commitment to rebuilding the nation, although not without lingering bitterness and unresolved tensions. Their prominence also speaks to how military service was intertwined with notions of honor, patriotism, and public service in 19th century America. While these men influenced society on land, naval warfare evolved with the Revolutionary encounter. The Monitor and Merrimac, CSS Virginia, fought the first battle between ironclad warships. The clash between the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, formerly the Merrimac, in 1862, marked a revolutionary moment in naval warfare, the first battle between ironclad warships. This confrontation signaled the end of wooden warships' dominance and the dawn of a new era dominated by armored, steam-powered vessels. The battle itself was a tense, slow duel in Hampton Roads, Virginia, with neither ship able to decisively defeat the other. Despite the stalemate, the engagement captured global attention, showcasing innovation born of necessity. Both sides had rushed to construct these ironclads to break naval blockades or defend vital ports. The duel underscored the industrial capacity and technological ingenuity fueling the war, where traditional tactics gave way to new strategies and weaponry. The Monitor's revolving turret and the Virginia's imposing iron armor symbolized a leap forward in military technology. This naval innovation would reshape maritime combat worldwide. While ironclads engaged at sea, soldiers engaged in lighter-hearted deceptions to keep morale up. Some soldiers would play practical jokes on new recruits, like telling them to search for snipe. The brutal reality of Civil War training camps wasn't just endless drills and marching. It also included a fair share of pranks, particularly at the expense of green recruits. One classic joke involved sending newcomers on a futile snipe hunt. Experienced soldiers would gleefully instruct the uninitiated to search for snipes, mythical creatures that didn't exist, or tasks like finding invisible objects or digging non-existent trenches. This hazing ritual was both a rite of passage and a way to break the tension, bonding the unit through shared laughter at the rookie's expense. While it might seem cruel, these pranks offered a momentary escape from the fear and monotony that gripped camp life. The snipe hunt became a metaphor for the naivete of new soldiers thrown into a harsh world where experience meant survival. It's a reminder that amidst the carnage, humor, and sometimes harmless cruelty helped men endure. Yet the war itself sometimes attracted unexpected spectators. The Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, was a popular spectator event for civilians in its early stages. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as Manassas, was not just a clash of armies, but a bizarre spectacle for civilians eager to witness war firsthand. Early in the conflict, many people, including women and families, traveled to the battlefield expecting a quick and glorious Union victory. They picnicked and watched the troops engage, treating the battle almost like a public event or outdoor performance. This naive enthusiasm starkly contrasted with the brutal reality that unfolded. A chaotic, bloody, and disorganized fight that shattered illusions of a swift war. Spectators quickly realized the grim seriousness of combat, with the battle ending in a Confederate victory and a chaotic Union retreat. The event exposed the gap between romantic notions of war and its harsh realities, serving as a sobering lesson to the nation. While civilians watched, soldiers on both sides sometimes found moments of unexpected camaraderie. There were instances of fraternization where soldiers from opposing sides would meet and chat during lulls in fighting. Despite the ferocity of the Civil War, there were strange and rare moments of fraternization where opposing soldiers met in no man's land to chat, exchange goods, or even share cigarettes. These lulls in fighting allowed men to briefly step out of their roles as enemies and remember their shared humanity. Soldiers might talk about home, swap stories, or joke about the absurdity of their situation. Temporary truces that humanized the war's face. Such interactions were dangerous, frowned upon by commanders, and carried risks of punishment. But they offered a psychological respite from the relentless violence. Fraternization reveals the complicated nature of civil conflict, where personal relationships and common bonds sometimes transcended political divisions. These fleeting connections didn't erase the brutality, but added depth to our understanding of the men behind the muskets. As soldiers paused to talk, the president kept his spirits high with his own brand of humor. Lincoln reportedly had a quirky sense of humor and loved to tell jokes and anecdotes. Abraham Lincoln is often remembered as the somber, reflective leader guiding a fractured nation through its darkest hour. But beneath that tall stovepipe hat was a man with a surprisingly quirky sense of humor. He loved telling jokes and anecdotes, sometimes to break tension, sometimes to connect with people from all walks of life. His humor wasn't slapstick, but often dry, self-deprecating, and laced with sharp wit. Lincoln used humor as a tool to disarm critics, lighten the mood in tense meetings, and remind everyone, including himself, that even in tragedy there's room for a smile. Some of his quips have survived in history books and oral traditions, painting a picture of a president who could laugh at the absurdity of politics and life. This lighter side makes Lincoln feel more human, more approachable, traits that undoubtedly helped him navigate the immense pressures of his office. While Lincoln cracked jokes in the halls of power, grim realities awaited many prisoners of war. The largest POW camp was Andersonville in Georgia, notorious for its harsh conditions. Andersonville Prison, officially Camp Sumter, was the largest and most infamous prisoner of war camp during the Civil War. Located in Georgia, it housed tens of thousands of Union soldiers captured by the Confederacy, but it quickly gained notoriety for its brutal, overcrowded, and unsanitary conditions. Andersonville was a place where hope went to die. Prisoners faced starvation, disease, exposure, and inadequate shelter. The camp's wooden stockade was surrounded by a deadline, a boundary soldiers dared not cross, or they risked being shot by guards. The mortality rate was staggering, with nearly 13,000 prisoners dying during the camp's 14 months of operation. Andersonville became a symbol of the war's cruelty and the suffering endured by POW, and its commander, Captain Henry Weirds, was later tried and executed for war crimes. The horrors of Andersonville remind us that the Civil War's atrocities extended beyond the battlefield and that human cruelty knows no uniform. Meanwhile, in camp life, soldiers found even the most mundane objects could serve unexpected purposes. Some soldiers used their bayonets as candle holders. In the dim light of campfires and flickering lanterns, practical soldiers found ingenious ways to make do with what they had, including turning their bayonets into candle holders. These sharp blades, attached to rifles for close combat, were repurposed by soldiers seeking to illuminate their tents or write letters after dark. By balancing candles on the bayonet's guard or mounting them on the blade itself, they created crude, makeshift lamps that shed just enough light to keep darkness at bay. This simple invention reveals the resourcefulness necessary for daily survival and the small comforts that soldiers improvised amid hardship. The bayonet candle holder is a metaphor for the war itself, an instrument of death transformed, however briefly, into a source of warmth and life. These small acts of creativity and adaptation highlight how soldiers endured the endless nights and uncertainty with a stubborn spark of ingenuity. The Confederate Army was sometimes called Johnny Reb, and the Union Army Billy Yank. The Civil War was not just a clash of armies, but also a cultural tug-of-war, embodied in the nicknames Johnny Reb for Confederate soldiers and Billy Yank for their Union counterparts. These monikers, coined during the war, simplified the complex identities of the soldiers into two symbolic figures representing the South and North. Johnny Reb evokes images of a rugged, independent Southerner fighting for his homeland, steeped in tradition and defiance. Conversely, Billy Yank symbolizes the industrious, disciplined Northern soldier, embodying the Union's fight to preserve the nation. These nicknames carried stereotypes, sometimes accurate, sometimes exaggerated. But they helped both sides humanize and mythologize the enemy. They appeared in newspapers, songs, and propaganda, becoming shorthand for the vast and brutal conflict. The labels reveal how language shaped public perception and morale, turning faceless soldiers into emblematic characters. Behind these nicknames, countless small towns and villages braced themselves for the passage of war. Many small towns and villages across the country claim to have been visited by generals. The Civil War swept through countless small towns and villages, many of which proudly claim that famous generals once set foot in their dusty streets. Whether true or embellished, these local legends highlight how deeply the war permeated everyday life, turning quiet hamlets into transient military hubs or strategic outposts. Hosting a general, even briefly, became a badge of honor, a point of pride that linked a community to the larger national drama. Soldiers camped on farms, roads were clogged with marching columns, and local civilians found themselves swept up in the tides of history. The presence of high-ranking officers often brought both opportunity and risk, as their movements signaled the shifting front lines and potential battles. These towns tell stories of unexpected encounters, requisitioned supplies, and uneasy coexistence with soldiers from both sides. The war's footprint was indiscriminate, stamping its mark not only on grand cities, but on the smallest communities. As armies marched and generals visited, the concept of total war took a darker turn. The concept of total war, targeting civilian resources as well as military, emerged during the conflict. The Civil War was a crucible for new ideas about warfare, including the brutal concept of total war. This strategy went beyond traditional battlefields, targeting not only enemy armies, but also the civilian infrastructure that supported them: farms, railroads, factories, and towns. The aim was to break the enemy's will to fight by destroying their means of survival, blurring the lines between combatants and civilians. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman famously embodied this approach during his March to the Sea, where his troops systematically devastated Southern resources to cripple the Confederacy's war effort. Total war introduced moral and ethical dilemmas as civilians bore the consequences of military strategy, suffering loss and displacement. It reshaped warfare into a more ruthless endeavor, reflecting the industrial scale and ideological stakes of the conflict. The concept shocked many contemporaries, but proved effective in hastening the war's end. As the scorched earth left scars on the land and its people, soldiers found solace in personal expressions, carving their stories into everyday objects. Some soldiers carved intricate designs into their canteens or other personal items. Amid the chaos and destruction of the Civil War, soldiers found ways to leave a personal mark on their limited possessions, often carving intricate designs into their canteens, rifles, or other belongings. These carvings ranged from simple initials and dates to elaborate scenes, symbols, or heartfelt messages. This practice wasn't just about decoration. It was a form of storytelling, identity preservation, and psychological escape. By etching their names or symbols into objects they carried daily, Soldiers created tangible reminders of themselves and their experiences. These carved items became personal artifacts, sometimes tokens of love, memories of home, or symbols of camaraderie. In the midst of anonymity and death, such handiwork asserted individuality and humanity. This creative impulse amid hardship highlights the complex emotional landscape of soldiers, facing mortality while yearning for permanence. These objects, bearing silent witness to personal stories, stand in stark contrast to the rapid communication methods emerging on the battlefield. The telegraph played a crucial role in wartime communication for the first time. The Civil War was the first major conflict where the telegraph revolutionized communication, allowing messages to be sent across vast distances almost instantaneously. Commanders could coordinate troop movements, relay intelligence, and receive orders with unprecedented speed. This technological leap changed the nature of warfare, shrinking the battlefield's effective size and enabling more dynamic strategies. Telegrapher units became essential, working under dangerous conditions to maintain lines and intercept enemy communications. The telegraph also linked politicians and generals, speeding up decision-making and shaping public perceptions through rapid news dispatches. However, reliance on telegraphy introduced new vulnerabilities. Lines could be cut or tapped, and misinformation could spread quickly. The Civil War's telegraph system was a precursor to modern military communication networks, emphasizing the increasing role of technology in war. While messages flashed through wires, soldiers on the ground grappled with names and identities, sometimes altered by simple mistakes. Ulysses S. Grant's real first name was Hiram, but he adopted Ulysses S. from a clerical error at West Point. Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general who would become one of America's most celebrated leaders, wasn't born with the name history remembers. His given name was Hiram Ulysses Grant, but during his appointment to West Point, a clerical error listed him as Ulysses S. Grant. Rather than correcting the mistake, Grant accepted the name, embracing the mix-up that would stick for life. The middle initial S didn't stand for anything. It was likely a mistaken insertion of his mother's maiden name, Simpson. This accidental renaming is a quirky footnote to the life of a man whose decisions would profoundly shape the country. Grant's acceptance of the new name reflects a practical, unpretentious character, focused more on duty than on personal vanity. The name Ulysses S. Grant carried the weight of leadership and victory, even if it started as a bureaucratic blunder. While Grant adjusted to his new identity, the war's final shots were about to ring out far away in unexpected places. The last shots of the Civil War were fired from a Confederate raider ship in the Bering Sea. While most people associate the final moments of the Civil War with dramatic surrenders on familiar Eastern battlefields, the truth is that the war's echoes reached far beyond the continent's heartland, even into the icy waters of the Bering Sea. The last known shots of the conflict were reportedly fired from a Confederate raider ship operating in these remote northern waters. This detail reveals the truly global reach of the war's naval warfare and the persistence of Confederate resistance, even after major Confederate armies had surrendered. These naval actions aimed to disrupt Union commerce and extend the war's impact internationally. The Bering Sea, far from the swamps and forests of Virginia, became an unlikely stage for the war's closing act. This distant skirmish reminds us that wars rarely end neatly or simultaneously across every theater, and that the Civil War's shadow lingered in places few would expect. While ships fired their final salvos, soldiers collected mementos from the battlefield. Many soldiers would collect souvenirs from battlefields, like bullets or pieces of uniforms. For soldiers living through the chaos and terror of the Civil War, collecting souvenirs from battlefields was a common, almost ritualistic practice. These keepsakes, spent bullets, fragments of uniforms, pieces of shattered equipment, served as tangible reminders of survival, comrades lost, or moments of personal significance. Souvenirs were not just trophies. They were a way to assert control and memory amid the unpredictability of war. Carrying a bullet that once flew past your head or a torn piece of a friend's uniform kept the war's reality close. tangible, and personal. These items were often shared, traded, or sent home as tokens of sacrifice and proof of participation in momentous events. This practice reveals the human desire to capture and preserve experiences, even horrific ones, and to create narratives out of the chaos. Souvenirs linked soldiers to history, making them active participants in a story larger than themselves. While soldiers hoarded these memories, their daily sustenance remained brutally basic. The average soldier's daily ration included salt pork or beef, hardtack, and coffee. Feeding thousands of soldiers during the Civil War was a logistical nightmare, and the typical daily ration reflected a grim balance of nutrition and practicality. Most soldiers subsisted on salt pork or beef, both heavily salted to preserve them, accompanied by hardtack, a hard, dry biscuit infamous for its durability and indigestibility. Coffee, often weak and bitter, was a vital stimulant that offered a brief comfort amid harsh conditions. This ration, while sufficient to sustain life, was monotonous and lacked fresh vegetables or fruits, leading to vitamin deficiencies and illnesses. Soldiers developed creative ways to make their meals more palatable, soaking hardtack in coffee or boiling salt pork to reduce its saltiness. The ration's simplicity and sameness became part of the war's daily grind, a constant reminder of scarcity and endurance. Eating was never a pleasure, but a necessity to survive grueling marches and battles. As soldiers chewed through their hardtack, nicknames and legends were born, starting with one of the war's most iconic figures. Confederate General Stonewall Jackson earned his nickname during the First Battle of Bull Run. Thomas Stonewall Jackson earned his legendary nickname during the chaos of the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, a moniker that would define his legacy forever. As the Confederate lines wavered under Union pressure, Jackson and his brigade stood firm, unmoving, resolute, and immovable like a stone wall. Witnesses claim that General Barnard B., struggling to rally his own men, pointed to Jackson's steadfast troops and exclaimed that there stood Jackson like a stone wall, urging his men to rally behind that unyielding example. The nickname captured Jackson's reputation for discipline, courage, and an almost mystical calm under fire. It also helped cement his status as a hero in the Southern cause, inspiring confidence and fear in equal measure. This moment exemplifies how individual acts of bravery and leadership became symbolic in the collective memory of the war. Jackson's Stonewall image contrasts sharply with the lighter, creative ways soldiers coped with hardship, including inventing their own slang. Some soldiers developed unique slang terms and phrases that are still used today. War breeds language as much as it breeds bullets, and the Civil War was no exception. Soldiers on both sides created slang and phrases that captured the absurdities, hardships, and camaraderie of their experience, many of which have survived into modern American English. Terms like bucket list originally referred to the list of things soldiers wanted to do before they died, while copacetic emerged to mean everything was fine and under control. Phrases such as put a sock in it, telling someone to be quiet, also trace back to the era. This vernacular was more than colorful language. It was a coping mechanism, a way to bond and inject humor into grim circumstances. The slang reflected the soldiers' wit and resilience, giving them tools to express their reality in a shared code. These linguistic legacies are a fascinating cultural byproduct of the conflict, linking us directly to the voices of those who fought over a century ago. While language flourished, soldiers also kept the company of familiar faces, both human and animal. The first Memorial Day was celebrated by formerly enslaved people in Charleston, South Carolina in 1865. The origins of Memorial Day trace back to a powerful and poignant celebration by formerly enslaved African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina in 1865. Shortly after Union forces captured the city, these freed men and women gathered to honor Union soldiers who had died in captivity at a Confederate prison camp known as Camp Sumter or Andersonville. They decorated the soldiers' graves with flowers and held a solemn ceremony, a ritual of remembrance and respect that was among the earliest Memorial Day observances. This act was profoundly symbolic. Those who had suffered under slavery now claimed the right to commemorate the lives lost in a war that promised, at last, freedom. Their observance highlighted the intertwining of memory, emancipation, and national healing. Memorial Day would grow into a nationwide holiday, but its roots in African American communities remind us of the war's deepest human and social impacts. As memories were honored, speeches were delivered, and among them stood one of the shortest yet most powerful in American history. Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address was only 272 words long and delivered in about 2 minutes. The Gettysburg Address is one of the most iconic speeches in American history, yet it was remarkably brief. Just 272 words spoken in about 2 minutes, delivered by President Abraham Lincoln on November 19, 1863, at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The speech distilled the war's meaning and the nation's hopes into a powerful, poetic few minutes. Lincoln's concise yet profound remarks honored the fallen soldiers and reframed the Civil War as a struggle not just for the Union, but for the principle of human equality and a new birth of freedom. Despite its brevity, the address had an enduring impact, elevating the ideals of democracy and sacrifice while inspiring generations to come. At the time, some critics found it too short or understated, but history has proven its lasting resonance. The Gettysburg Address is a reminder that sometimes the most profound messages come in the smallest packages. While Lincoln's words echoed across the nation, soldiers found their own ways to cope with the war's grim reality through humor. Despite the seriousness of the war, soldiers on both sides often found ways to find humor and lighten the mood. Amid the bloodshed, exhaustion, and despair of the Civil War, soldiers on both sides clung to humor as a vital coping mechanism. Jokes, sarcastic remarks, witty nicknames, and darkly comic stories circulated through camps and trenches, providing brief respites from fear and suffering. This humor wasn't frivolous. It was a survival tool that helped maintain morale and human connection under dire circumstances. Soldiers joked about everything, from the taste of their rations and the incompetence of officers to the absurdity of military bureaucracy and the randomness of survival. Pranks, songs, and tall tales circulated, creating a shared culture that bound troops together. This levity didn't diminish the seriousness of their experience, but rather underscored the resilience of the human spirit. It also offered a way to process trauma, transform pain into laughter, and face death with defiance. Humor became a silent weapon against the overwhelming weight of war. As the war wound down, memories lingered, complex, painful, and unresolved, just like the mysteries it left behind.